Welcome to the T3 Raider Roots podcast. This is episode 7, and I'm your host, T3 Raider Facts. And we've been tracing the roots of the Raiders organization. In our last episode, we saw Al Davis and the Raiders finally come together and turn around the fortunes of the football team. Now we'll see how that pride and poise starts to change the character of the team, as well as the civic pride of the East Bay. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson was elected to a full term as President of the United States in a landslide victory. The Beatles made their first American television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and a new civil rights bill was passed banning discrimination in voting, jobs, and public accommodations. The city of Oakland was fast becoming a West Coast city of industry, commerce, and recreation. The area was undergoing mass changes and improvements. The athletic hub of the area was the new Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, which had just begun construction, a 55,000-seat stadium, which would be the new home of the Silver and Black, as they were already being referred to. As it was starting its 5th year of operation and coming, and the astounding rebuilding of the Raiders was continuing. Just as in 1963, there were no playoffs, and just as in 1963, the team got off to a slow start, but then finished with a flurry, winning their last 2 games against the 2 teams that would eventually square off to decide the 1964 AFL Championship, the Buffalo Bills and the San Diego Chargers. There were other giant strides made by the Raiders organization. Fan enthusiasm caused ticket sales to soar. Off-season trades for top players were made, and the development of young rookies were noted. Player benefits in the form of a player pension plan and group medical insurance were established. Some experts contended that under Davis, the Raiders' 1964 draft was the best in all of professional football for that year. Speaking of 1964, Al Davis's first draft pick was Arizona State running back Tony Lorick, who was also drafted by the NFL's Baltimore Colts. However, the Raiders didn't sign Lorick, the only time that ever happened to the Raiders in their existence under Davis for a first-round pick. Actually, the Raiders did have Lorick under contract. Davis used the help of a Los Angeles sports writer when he, Davis, invited the young man to come to Southern California. In a downtown LA hotel, Lorick put his signature on 3 copies of a player contract and then went back to his room. A few minutes later, the sports writer named Brad Pye had a knock at the door. He opened to find Frank Cush, the Arizona State head coach, Lorick's head coach, standing there. Cush asked where Lorick was, and Pye informed Cush that the young man had returned to his room. Cush asked if Lorick had signed with the Raiders, and Pye nodded in the affirmative. Cush then asked to see the contract. When Pye produced the document, Cush grabbed them and took off running. That was the last contract that the Raiders had with Lorick, and he went on to sign with the Baltimore Colts. When this happened, Al did 2 things. First, he vowed that he would never again lose a number 1 pick, and he never did. Second, he went after and signed another Arizona State running back, Larry Todd, the next year, who still had a year of eligibility, for the sole purpose of getting revenge on Cush. Even though Todd never developed, Al made his point. The Raiders did pick up some much-needed help with their second-round draft pick by picking Miami tackle Dan Connors, who was then converted to linebacker and would go on to be a mainstay for the next 11 years. They also added Big Ben Davidson, a cast-off from the Washington Redskins. Davis loved the fact that Ben was 6 foot 8 inches and could be an imposing figure on the defensive line. Davidson first showed up to the Raiders camp with a full beard, but Al kind of leaned on him to shave it. But Ben Davidson retained a big handlebar mustache, and that became his trademark. To add some spark to the offense, Davis brought in AFL star running back Billy Cannon from Houston. Injuries had slowed Cannon, and the bloom was kind of off the rose with the Oilers, so Davis brought him in and converted him to a tight end. Davis knew that he needed to generate interest in the Oakland franchise, especially with the rival 49ers of the NFL just across the bay. Davis was able to distinguish the look and image of his team and instill pride within the growing East Bay area. If Davis could win, he knew that he could get Oakland to build a first-class modern facility. With that would come the fan base, the money, and the success of a great sports franchise. His first target was the Oakland Tribune newspaper. The Trib had a small circulation of about 200,000 and was considered an East Bay paper, paling in comparison to the San Francisco Chronicle and the Hearst-owned Examiner. The Trib was published by William Nolan, a conservative Republican U.S. Senator representing California. Nolan wanted to make his paper the West Coast version of the Washington Post. He failed in this endeavor, probably because the politics of Northern California, particularly that of the East Bay, had different ideologies, and they differed from his editorial leanings. The West Coast paper of record, what Nolan truly aspired to be, was the Los Angeles Times. They recognized the shifting political winds while moving from that of conservative Republican mouthpiece to a paper of international journalism with a sports page that was worthy of the region's rise in both pro and college athletics. Davis knew that sports could propel a newspaper's circulation and increase its readership. He arranged a deal whereby the Trib became the go-to arm of Raider publicity. Davis promised that all stories would be filtered not to the Chronicle or the Examiner, but directly to the Trib. It was a pure I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine arrangement, in many ways a first for the East Bay, which had always groveled for attention in an effort to get San Francisco to recognize them. Davis truly helped put the Oakland Tribune on the map. The Trib printed every possible Raider angle, and their readership eagerly devoured it. In retrospect, however, this was a symptom more than the cause of the Raiders' success. Had the team continued to be a loser on the field in 1963, no one would have cared to read about the doings of their stars. But in making the arrangement that he did, Davis saw to it that what the team did, when a team did win on the field, it would not be like a tree falling in the woods. People would actually notice. Davis was in Oakland years before baseball's Kansas City Athletics relocated to the East Bay, but Davis did something that A's owner Charlie O. Finley did not do. He tapped into the Oakland psyche. While Finley marketed his team as a circus act with garish uniforms and handlebar mustaches, Davis went for fear and intimidation. In confluence with the growing Hells Angels and Black Panther movements that grew up side by side with the Oakland Raiders in the 1960s. The team and the city were blue-collar, outsiders, rebels, and Al Davis freely and readily promoted that. Before the start of the 1964 season, Davis had already had a successful first year as head coach, and he already solidified the team with the community and made the Raiders respectable. Davis and his wife, Caroli, took a break and went to Las Vegas for a few days, during which time Davis had lunch at the Riviera Hotel with Ron Amos, the sports editor of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and soon-to-be publicist and sports promoter. In print, Davis made the following predictions to Amos in the sports editor's column. 1, there will eventually be a World Series between the AFL and the NFL because the fans and the players will demand it. 2, the AFL will gradually become equal to the NFL in player strength. And 3, television will make pro football even more popular than it is currently. Without TV, the AFL would have died a long time ago. Davis proposed the Raiders play an exhibition game against Houston in Las Vegas if the guarantee was right. Sure enough, on August 29th, 1964, the Raiders and Oilers met in the only pro football game that's ever been staged in Sin City before this year, 2020. Bud Adams used the Stardust Hotel for Oilers headquarters, and Davis used the Desert Inn for the Raiders. Skeptics said that the hotels would never accommodate the black players, but they did. The exhibition game was played at Cashman Field, a high school stadium, and it overflowed with more than 12,000 fans. The cheerleaders were the showgirls from the opposing team hotels. It was a real spectacle. The team stumbled out of the gate at the beginning of the 1964 season. They lost their first game at home to the Boston Patriots by just 3 points. Then after losses to Houston and Kansas City, they were 0-3 and embarking on a 3-week road trip in much the same fashion as the year before. On the road trip, they were 0-2-1, managing to salvage a 43-43 tie with Boston in the last game of the East Coast swing. Before that game in Boston, there was no point going home in between games because of the travel expenses. Previously that summer, Al Davis had asked a writer in New York if he knew of a nice, quiet place for the team to practice during the week, away from the hustle and bustle of Boston, where the players could stay out of trouble. What was recommended to Davis was a resort in the Catskill Mountains, an hour and a half northwest of Boston, Kutsher's Hotel. The resort hotel, as it turns out, catered to the Jewish population of the city and was kosher. Some of the players asked for milk with dinner, but they were not allowed to have it along with a meat dish. There was no bacon for breakfast, and pork chops were definitely off the menu. There was no place to go for a beer to unwind. The players were miserable on the tail end of their trip. One residual effect of the trip was made on the quarterback, Tom Flores. His introduction to lox and eggs in the Catskills became a new love of his, which has lasted all these years later. But that was just one little silver lining in what was looking like it would be a really bad season. But just as they had done the previous year, the Raiders finished strong. After starting 0-5-1, they were 5-2-1 over the next 8 games. They ended up on an up note, winning their last 2 games against the 2 teams that will eventually square off for the league championship in 1964, the Buffalo Bills and the San Diego Chargers. The Raiders had a final record of 5-7-2, the only season in Al Davis's head coaching ledger that didn't seem to bother his losses. His bosses, Wayne Valley and Ed McGaugh, the managing general partners. They gave Davis a raise and a new 5-year contract. Throughout the podcast, I'll be featuring some of the memorable characters of the Raiders throughout the years. Looking back at 1962, one good thing that happened out of that year when the Raiders went 1-13 was the signing of rookie Dan Birdwell out of the University of Houston. He was first drafted as a linebacker, but converted over to the defensive line. He wasn't all that big as a lineman, but he did have good size for a linebacker. The Birdman, or Birdie, as he was called by his teammates, was an extremely likable guy. He was well built and had a ton of natural strength. A lot of that strength really didn't come out in 1962 because the team was so bad. There were many new faces. Birdwell's strength really started to show in 1963 with the arrival of Al Davis. Instead of trying to simply play the old-fashioned 4-3 defense, AFL teams started to experiment with overs and unders and positioning the defensive ends in different spots relative to the tight end. Once the Raiders perfected their own defensive scheme, Birdwell started to flourish. 2-a-day training camps in hot Santa Rosa turned out to be very tiring for the players. In between practices, players would eat lunch and then go relax a bit before the afternoon practice started. One of the rituals for many of the players was watching the daytime soap opera Days of Our Lives. When the players went to get taped up before the afternoon session, most had taken a nap and many had watched the soap. Imagine a group of big masculine guys stretching and getting ready to go to war on the practice field while talking about the events on that day's soap episode. Who was doing what and with whom. It's a pretty comical visual. Danny, however, would often be working on his car, stretched out underneath it, working on it even in the hot sun. Danny had an extremely high threshold for pain. He hurt his knee, which required surgery. They put him in a cast, which went all the way up to his hip, much different from today's procedure. During the latter part of his career, Birdie was involved with some service stations. He was working the stations in his cast, hobbling around. Pain was not an issue with Danny, but he got so tired of wearing the cast that he took it off himself rather than waiting for the doctors to tell him when it was time. The doctors, the coaches, and the training staff all felt that move shortened his professional football career. His last year turned out to be 1969. Before Al Davis finally got Danny settled on the defensive line, he was trying to find a place for Birdie, so he tried him on the offensive line. Former quarterback and coach Tom Flores remembers that Birdie had this terrible habit of always stepping on other people's feet, both in the huddle and at the line of scrimmage. His teammates always had to watch out for him. Birdie also had a famous knockout shot. During practices, he would often line up against the tight end, who starting in 1964 was the newly acquired Billy Cannon. When the ball was snapped, Birdie would reach over and smack Billy in the helmet. Head slaps were legal back then. After one time, Billy said, "Birdie, don't do that. Don't slap me in the head." Birdie said, "Okay." They ran the play and everything was fine. They came out of the huddle in the next play and lined up once again. Birdie was over Cannon. When the ball was snapped, Birdie slapped Cannon across the helmet. When Cannon got mad, yelled at Birdie, Danny responded, "Oh, you forgot to tell me not to." Now, during the season, in one of the games, Birdie lined up over the tight end. When the ball was snapped, Birdie head slapped the tight end. The quarterback went back to pass. The tight end took 4 or 5 steps, slowed down, and then just fell. The Raiders found this moment hilarious, particularly as they looked back at it on film. Birdie had hit the tight end so hard that it was enough to daze him and then made him go down. The guy didn't fall until he was about 5 yards up the field. It was a delayed reaction knockout shot. That kind of move is no longer legal in the NFL, but Birdie took his strength and he put it to good use. Birdie always had enthusiasm. He always had fun on the field, and he only knew one speed, full throttle. Dan Birdwell may not have been a Hall of Famer, but he was a real character of the game and a true Raider. Now, I mentioned the tight end position earlier, the name Billy Cannon. Cannon is definitely a player worth noting in Raiders' early history, even if he is more widely recognized as the star running back and legendary Heisman Trophy winner from LSU in 1959, and for coming to the new AFL in 1960 and helping the Houston Oilers win the first two league titles. Besides his sometimes contentious relationship with Dan Birdwell in the practice field, highlighted earlier, Cannon was the first major star of the American Football League. He also represents one of the great administrative failures of Pete Rozelle, then of the Los Angeles Rams, before he became NFL commissioner. In 1960, Rozelle and the Rams had also drafted Cannon, but crafty Bud Adams, the owner of the Oilers, had signed Cannon to a conflicting contract under the goalposts after the Sugar Bowl game. The case had gone to court, and the Oilers won the case as Cannon's pact with the Rams was ruled illegal. And then Rozelle was unexpectedly elected as NFL commissioner shortly thereafter. Cannon had been Houston's star ball carrier for the first 4 seasons, but he'd been slowed by a bad back, and relations between him and the Oilers management had begun to sour. Al Davis traded for him in 1964. He liked Cannon's size and speed, but he had other ideas for the star running back. He moved Cannon to tight end, where he'd be covered by a linebacker or strong safety who just couldn't keep up with him. This created a nightmare matchup for opposing defenses, and Cannon became the first in a long line of Raider tight ends that would fit the bill. It also marked the first time that Davis picked up a star player from another team and gave him a second chance to achieve greatness in a different environment. And so these two things became hallmarks of the Al Davis legacy with the Raiders. Despite the team's overall lack of success in the 1964 season, civic pride was high in Oakland. The Oakland Bank of Commerce and the Oakland Raiders Booster Club put together a year in review video, which enabled the fans to get a closer look at the players and review the action on the field. It also gave Al Davis an opportunity to address the fan base and the corporate sponsors en masse, allowing him to make the most of the television medium. Here are Al's words to the fan base at the end of the 1964 season. And I quote, "In 1964, we had a fine professional football draft. But as in 1963 and in 1964, we knew that more than points, we needed a sense of pride and we needed poise. And the veteran football players that you've just watched in this highlight film now have that pride and poise, and they will be the hardcore of our football program in 1965. The new television contract with NBC will give us greater coverage and more exposure than ever before. As well as the 7 great rivalries we will play at Frank Ewell Field, you'll be able to watch the Raiders battle the Eastern Division football teams and the Western Division football teams in the coming year. The Boston Patriots, the champion Buffalo Bills, the up-and-coming New York Jets, and you'll be able to witness the Houston Oilers in their new stadium, the Dome Stadium in Houston, as well as the Kansas City Chiefs, the Denver Broncos, and the Chargers of San Diego. I want to reiterate that we did not come to Oakland and to the East Bay for the sake of a job. We came because we believe in the future of this team and the future of this area. My enthusiasm has not diminished in the job in the years to come, and I hope your enthusiasm will continue, and come what may, be proud too that you are a vital part of the progress of this football team. As well as on the TV and radio networks, we hope we'll see you in the stadium in 1965. Al mentioned the importance of television, and the new television contract truly changed the landscape of the AFL and of professional football as a whole. In our next episode, we will focus entirely on that new television contract, how it came into being, and how it impacted the sport. Once again, I'd like to give credit to Murray Olderman, Ken Rappaport, Jim Otto, Michael McCambridge, NFL Films, Steve Travers, and special thanks to Tom Flores for his own remembrance of Danny Birdwell. Thank you for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe to my channel and go back and catch any of the previous episodes you may have missed, and share it with a friend. Until next time, this is T3 Raider Facts, reminding you that passion always outlives fashion, and wishing you a bright silver moon shining in the dark black night.